If you look at her now, you see a queen. You see a woman draped in black velvet, standing on the stage of the Golden Globes, bathed in a light so golden it looks like it was summoned by the gods themselves. You hear a voice that doesn't just speak, it thunders with the weight of $1 billion empire. When she accepts the Cecil B. DeMille Award, the entire room, the most powerful people in Hollywood, rise to their feet. They don't just applaud, they bow. In that moment, she is the most trusted, the most visible, and perhaps the most powerful woman in the world. But strip away the lights. Turn off the applause. Peel back the layers of success, the private jets and the billions of dollars. If you look closely enough into her eyes, past the confidence of the media mogul, you can still see the shadow of someone else. You see a dusty road in rural Mississippi where the heat rises from the earth like a physical weight. You see a dirt path where no cameras ever go. And walking down that path is not a queen, but a tiny, fragile girl. She is barefoot, her hair is unkempt, and she is wearing a dress that scratches her skin raw with every step, a dress stitched together from old, discarded potato sacks. The local children point, they laugh. The adults look right through her, as if she were a ghost haunting the cotton fields. In that world, she has no power. She has no audience. She has no voice. This is the paradox of Oprah Winfrey. Before she could save the world with her empathy, she had to survive a world that offered her none. Before she could become the mother figure to millions, she had to navigate a childhood where she was fundamentally, devastatingly alone. The woman who would eventually teach the world how to heal first had to learn how to bleed in silence. This is not the story of a billionaire. This is the story of a survivor, and it begins in the dirt. Koska, Mississippi in the 1950s was not a place for dreamers. It was a place of survival. It was a landscape painted in the brown of the earth and the white of the cotton fields, ruled by a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush you. Here, on a small, isolated farm, Oprah's life began. But it didn't begin with a mother's warm embrace. Her mother, Vernita, was barely more than a child herself when she gave birth, and soon she was gone, leaving Oprah in the care of her grandmother, Hattie Mae Lee. One of Oprah's earliest memories is not of playing with toys, but of the well. The water pump was rusted and stubborn, much like the land itself. Every day, her tiny hands would grip the cold iron handle, pulling with all her might to drag water up from the dark earth. It was a rhythmic, lonely task. It was there, staring down into the dark abyss of the well, that Oprah found her first reflection. The water would settle, and a small, sad face would stare back at her. She would look at that reflection and wonder, "Who are you? Why are you here?" There were no other children to play with. The isolation was absolute. But the human heart, especially the heart of a brilliant child, cannot survive in a vacuum. It needs connection. It needs to speak. So Oprah improvised. She didn't have dolls. She didn't have friends. So she turned to the only living things that would stand still long enough to listen, the farm animals. She gave names to the chickens. She had long, complex conversations with the pigs. But her most constant companions were the creatures most people would recoil from. In the dark corners of the farmhouse, Oprah would find cockroaches. To anyone else, they were pests. To a lonely girl starving for attention, they were an audience. She would talk to them. She would tell them stories. She would create entire worlds where she wasn't just a poor girl on a farm, but someone important, someone worth listening to. It is a heartbreaking image. A future media titan, a woman who would one day interview presidents and kings, practicing her first monologues to insects on a dirt floor. But it was here, in this crushing loneliness, that her imagination began to stretch its wings. She learned that if the world wouldn't give her a reality she could bear, she would have to invent a new one. But reality has a way of intruding, often violently. Hattie Mae believed in the Old Testament way of raising a child. Spare the rod and spoil the child. But on that farm, the rod was not spared. It was used with terrifying frequency. Oprah learned early that love and pain were tangled together like thorny vines. One Sunday, she was dressed for church. Her grandmother wanted her to look presentable, to be a good girl. But children are clumsy. Oprah stepped near the water pail, and her fingers slipped. The water splashed out, soaking her dress and the floor. It was an accident, a meaningless, trivial mistake. But to Hattie Mae, it was an act of defiance. The switch, a thin, flexible tree branch, was pulled from the yard. The beating that followed was not just physical. It was a lesson in powerlessness. Oprah didn't cry out in rebellion. She did what many children in trauma do. She dissociated. She learned to leave her body. She would stand there, feeling the sting of the switch, but in her mind, she was floating above the room, watching the scene unfold as if it were happening to someone else. This isn't me, she would think. I am not this broken girl. I am somewhere else. This ability to detach, to observe pain rather than just feeling it, would become her armor. But armor is heavy, and for a child, it is a crushing weight to carry. If the beatings broke her spirit in private, the poverty tried to break her dignity in public. Poverty in Mississippi wasn't just about hunger. It was about shame. It was visual. It was tactile. And nothing symbolized this shame more than the potato sack dress. Money was scarce, and Hattie Mae was pragmatic to a fault. Why buy fabric when there were perfectly good burlap sacks lying around? So she took the rough brown sacks that had held potatoes, cut holes for arms and a head, and stitched them together. Imagine the texture of burlap against a child's soft skin. It is coarse, it itches, it chafes. It is a material meant for vegetables, not for people. Wearing that dress to school or church wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a social death sentence. Oprah would walk into a room and the atmosphere would shift. She could hear the snickers rippling through the crowd. She could feel the eyes of other children, children who had real clothes, real shoes, boring into her. Look at her, they would whisper. Look at the sack girl. Children can be cruel, their laughter sharp as knives. They didn't see Oprah. They didn't see her intelligence, her bright eyes, or her desperate desire to be liked. They only saw the poverty draped over her body. They reduced her entire existence to a potato sack. In those moments, standing alone in a crowd of laughing children, Oprah felt a burning desire take root in her chest. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was determination. It was a silent vow made to the universe. Looking at her reflection in the well water, wearing that badge of humiliation, she decided that this would not be her forever. She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she knew she was bigger than that farm. She was bigger than that sack. She was destined for more than just survival. But survival would get harder before it got easier. Because soon, the farm, the only home she had ever known, as harsh as it was, would be taken away. She was about to be sent to the city, to Milwaukee, to a mother she didn't know, and to a darkness that would make the beatings on the farm seem like mercy. The girl in the potato sack was about to walk into a nightmare. The bus that carried her north might as well have been a portal to another planet. Mississippi disappeared in the window like a faded photograph, fields shrinking into patches, dirt roads dissolving into asphalt, the sky closing in behind rising buildings. Milwaukee hit her senses like cold water. The air was sharper, metallic. The streets smelled of gasoline instead of soil. Where Mississippi breathed in long silences, Milwaukee clattered. Sirens, voices, traffic, arguments spilling from windows. Nothing seemed to listen here. Everything demanded. A child barely 9 years old stepped off the bus, her suitcase small enough to be mistaken for a lunchbox, her heart still searching for familiar soil. Her mother, Vernita, stood waiting, not with open arms, but with a practical nod, a gesture less of recognition than of obligation. "Come on," she said, turning before the child could answer. There was no warm greeting, no "I missed you," just footsteps leading her into an apartment that felt crowded with strangers. Siblings she didn't know, cousins in and out, faces indifferent, movement constant. Oprah, who once talked to roaches because they would listen, felt Milwaukee swallow her name before anyone even asked for it. The couch became her living space, though couch implied comfort. It was more a sunken seat with flattened cushions she shared with coats tossed carelessly over her at night. Sometimes she was moved to the porch when men were over, left to sleep curled against wind and noise, the city reminding her how unwanted things are pushed aside. The farm had been harsh, but predictable. Pain came with lessons. Water spilled, belt raised. Here, pain was unpredictable, not from discipline, but neglect. Her mother moved around her like she was furniture, feeding her without speaking, sending her to school without checking if she understood where it was. The woman was not cruel. She was simply too tired to give what she did not have. And Oprah, desperate for belonging, misread exhaustion for rejection. To be unwanted was not a feeling anymore. It was a location, a status, a silent sentence. She tried to adjust. She memorized which cabinet creaked, which stair groaned, which relative smelled like stale beer, which room she wasn't allowed to enter. Milwaukee was survival, but without the dignity of purpose the farm had forced on her. And then came the day innocence ended. So quietly the world didn't hear it. It was summer, the kind Vernita barely registered except as more days to get through. A relative, older, familiar enough to trust, offered Oprah the kind of currency children obey. "Come with me," he said. "I'll buy you ice cream." Sweetness, attention, invitation. She followed. The house was dim. A bedroom door clicked shut. What happened next did not make sense to her body or her mind. It felt like falling through a trapdoor. Not pain first, but confusion. She did not know how to name what was taken. She only remembered wanting to disappear into the wall, to float back to Mississippi, where the roaches would at least listen. When it was over, he wiped her face, straightened her clothes, and pressed change into her hand. "Don't tell nobody," he said. "Go get your ice cream." She walked back outside, sunlight too bright, world too loud. She held coins in her hand like proof she had imagined nothing. She bought ice cream and couldn't eat it. She let it melt down her wrist, sticky warmth that disgusted her, but somehow fit her confusion. Her mother never asked where she'd been. No one wondered why she was quiet. The silence became law. Trauma didn't erupt in her. It leaked. It showed in things too small to worry an adult. Her sudden flinching at loud sounds. Her drifting mind during lessons. Her awkward laughter at jokes that weren't funny. But no one noticed. Children suffering rarely look tragic. They look troublesome. Oprah learned this quickly. When the ache became unbearable, she searched for substitutes, something to convince someone she mattered. She began stealing small coins, not for toys, but for candy, brightly colored sweets she distributed to classmates like bribes for temporary inclusion. Sugar replaced affection. For 5 minutes, someone would sit with her. For 10, a girl would hold her hand while they walked to recess. But when the candy ran out, so did the company. Love became transactional, a thing to purchase, a fleeting high that collapsed into emptiness. Her mother caught her once with stolen change. The scolding was sharp but short, punishment without insight. Vernita did not know the theft was not rebellion, but begging. In the quiet of night, Oprah lay awake rehearsing answers to questions no one ever asked. Why don't you choose me? Am I worth keeping? If I disappeared, would you notice? She began to understand something devastating, that neglect had a sound, not yelling, but nothing. The farm had hurt her body. Milwaukee began to dismantle her soul. The girl in the potato sack had once imagined escape. Now she imagined visibility. She didn't want riches or fame. She wanted to be seen, held, heard. But Milwaukee was not a place that made room for fragility. So she built armor, sharp wit in classrooms, show-off behavior in front of kids, secrets hidden like weapons. Teachers called her dramatic. They didn't understand the stage was the only space where she could control the hurt. The lights in Milwaukee were fluorescent, too harsh, too revealing. But inside Oprah, something darker hid, something whispering that she must trade pieces of herself for crumbs of affection. No one told her she was not to blame. No one told her love was not earned through pain. So she believed what childhoods of neglect teach. If they don't want you, you must become someone they cannot ignore. Milwaukee did not give her belonging, but it gave her hunger, a fire she would carry into adulthood, a need to prove her worth, a voice born from silence. The descent was not dramatic. It was quiet, incremental, invisible to everyone except the little girl lying on a couch she did not choose, waiting for someone to look her way. And though she didn't know it, this was the shaping of her future gift. To hear the unheard, to see the unseen, because once she was both. Silence does not always follow trauma. Sometimes it precedes it. In Milwaukee, Oprah learned that terrible things could happen without anyone noticing, and worse, without anyone wanting to know. By 10, she had discovered a method of survival. She made herself small. Small enough not to bother, quiet enough not to attract trouble, but visible enough to avoid being forgotten entirely. It didn't work. One night, a different relative pulled her aside. A casual voice, a gesture to follow, a half-closed door. She obeyed. Children are trained to. In that room, the violation repeated. Not rage, but entitlement. Her body froze before her mind could understand. Her eyes chased something on the ceiling. A crack, a stain. Anywhere but here. Afterward, she did not cry. She tucked the experience into the same compartment where melted ice cream had gone the year before. Adults returned to their routines. Dinner was served. Prayers were spoken over food. No one knew the table held a child swallowing a scream. The secret grew roots. But secrets do not stay still inside a child. They metastasize, changing behavior in ways nobody links to truth. She became louder at school, more dramatic, needy for attention. Teachers scolded her for interruptions, never realizing they were life signals. But home was worse. Her mother's apartment rotated people, lean men with weary eyes, visitors who stayed too long, voices she didn't trust. One evening, while washing dishes, she felt someone behind her, a family friend, breath close, hands too familiar. She dropped a plate, shattered porcelain on linoleum. No one asked why she trembled. The next time it happened, she said no, too soft to matter. The world had given her no language to name assault, so she described it in her head as being used, as though it were a chore, her place in the family hierarchy. Her refuge became school hallways, church pews, library shelves. She began rehearsing escape in fantasy, imagining herself on stage, speaking into microphones, people listening, not applauding, listening. But fantasies don't shield bodies. At 12, another relative continued the cycle. She resisted one night, fled the apartment barefoot. She ran, not toward freedom, but away from the unbearable. The night swallowed her. A policeman saw her hours later, a small girl wandering with no coat. He returned her home. No questions asked. Inside, nobody asked where she'd gone. Nobody noticed the pillowcase missing from her makeshift bed, stuffed with 2 shirts and a comb, her attempt at leaving. Invisibility can feel like death. For Oprah, it became armor. She decided on a new adaptation. I will act out. I will misbehave. Someone will have to look at me then. She stole money not for candy now, but for lipstick, earrings, small trinkets, tokens she gave to classmates in exchange for affection. She wasn't buying friendship. She was bartering for existence. But every burst of laughter at school, every moment someone chose to sit beside her, fell apart when the bell rang. Home awaited. The apartment smelled of cigarettes and fatigue. Her mother came home late, silent, exhausted, barely glancing at her daughter. Oprah began to internalize a belief that would haunt her for years. If even my mother doesn't want me, maybe no one ever will. This belief wasn't spoken. It was absorbed, wordless, cellular. She began associating pain with worth. Attention, even abusive attention, felt more real than being ignored. Some nights she crawled beneath the thin blanket on the couch, imagining the roaches in Mississippi, her old listeners, wondering if they missed her. Milwaukee had not given her new friends. It had taken her old imaginary ones away. She developed a habit, talking to herself quietly. What is wrong with me? Why didn't anyone stop them? Why didn't anyone see? The shame was not that something terrible happened, but that she must deserve it, since adults acted normal, since the world did not intervene. When she tried to hint, a dismissive reply cut her hopes. Stop making up stories. Her young mind translated, truth is dangerous. Silence keeps you alive. So she sealed her mouth. But silence is not peace. It is pressure. She exploded in small suspensions from school, petty theft, tantrums. To adults, she looked like a problem child, defiant, dramatic, too much. Nobody considered she was drowning. By 13, the abuse blurred. Faces changed, location shifted, but the betrayal remained consistent. She began to believe she was damaged goods, unworthy of love, incapable of purity. This belief was the most devastating violation of all. Late one night, she stared at her reflection in a dark kitchen window, an outline of herself floating against city lights. She whispered, "I am nothing." The window didn't argue. Milwaukee had taken the girl in the potato sack and turned her into a secret, a child whose pain was invisible and whose voice was irrelevant. But beneath all that damage, something strange survived, a yearning to be heard, really heard. She didn't understand it yet, but the instinct that would one day build an empire was already forming. No one had saved her, so she would become someone who could save others. But before she would rise, life would drive her lower. The secret had a consequence, growing inside her without permission, without understanding, without hope. She was about to learn that silence doesn't protect, it costs, and the bill was coming due. At 14, Oprah's body betrayed her before she even knew it was speaking. She had survived the secrets, survived the silences, but consequences do not ask permission, they simply arrive. It began subtly, a tightness in her belly, fatigue that made teachers think she was lazy, clothes stretching in places she didn't remember growing. She dismissed it, chalked it up to weight gain, hormones, the normal awkwardness of girlhood. Denial is easy when truth is unspeakable. She had no language for pregnancy, no mother to confide in, no adult who had ever explained how babies were made. Her understanding of her own body stopped at survival. She did not imagine it could revolt against her. Weeks passed. Her stomach expanded. Each night on the couch, she pressed her hands against the swell, trying to flatten it, as if shame were something that could be shoved down. In the mirror, she twisted her torso, testing angles. Maybe it wasn't noticeable yet. Maybe it would go away. But the swelling persisted, a silent drumbeat under her shirts. Fear grew teeth. The memory of the abuse, the uninvited hands, the locked doors, returned, suddenly horrific in its consequence. She wasn't just hurt. She was marked. She began wearing oversized clothes, cramming herself into tight belts, leaning forward at her desk to hide the curve. She avoided gym class, showers, anything that might reveal her. At home, no one noticed, or pretended not to. Her mother was drowning in exhaustion, shifts, and survival. Oprah was merely a shadow in the corner. But shadows cannot hide forever. One night, pain ripped through her lower abdomen, sharp enough to bend her in half. An aunt saw her breathless, sweat beading along her temples. "What's wrong with you?" The question wasn't concern, it was irritation. Oprah couldn't speak. Fear strangled explanation. A hand grabbed her shirt. Her aunt stared, saw what Oprah could no longer hide. "My God," she gasped, "this girl is pregnant." The word detonated. Pregnant. Not abused, not harmed, not violated. The blame landed where it always does, on the child who never asked for any of it. The room filled with accusation. Who did this? What were you doing? How dare you embarrass this family? Oprah stood silent, not because she refused to speak, but because she didn't know how to form the truth in language adults would hear. She didn't know it was called rape. She didn't know she was allowed to say no. She didn't know innocence could be taken, and yet she be blamed for it. They rushed her to a hospital, not gently, but urgently, like evidence they wanted gone. Bleach air, pale walls, a bed that looked too big for her. She was small again, the potato sack girl, but this humiliation was worse. Here, her pain was procedure. Her terror was paperwork. Doctors murmured medical terms. Oprah didn't understand any of them. They said premature. She didn't know what that meant. They spoke of blood pressure and dilation. She stared at the ceiling tiles, counting cracks to stay conscious. When labor came, it arrived like punishment. Contractions seized her. Not a woman becoming a mother, but a child being devoured by something larger than she was. She breathed in gasps, back arching, hands clutching rails. No mother's voice soothed her. No grandmother's prayer hovered over her. She was alone. Hours blurred, or minutes. Time surrendered to torment. Then a faint cry, too faint, like a hiccup swallowed by air. A nurse lifted a fragile, tiny body, skin translucent, limbs too thin. Oprah didn't reach out. She was frozen between terror and disbelief. She had not imagined a baby. She had imagined escape. Then silence. Not the room, the life. He didn't make it, someone whispered. That was the moment her heart split, not from grief alone, but from shame so heavy she couldn't breathe. They asked her if she wanted to name him. Name him, as if she understood naming, as if anyone had taught her ritual. She whispered, Canaan. She didn't know why, only that she remembered hearing somewhere that Canaan meant promise. Perhaps a twisted mercy, a promise never fulfilled, a hope buried before she even understood it. Days after, home was colder than before. Relatives murmured behind closed doors. She walked through rooms like she was contagious. And then came the bottom. In a laundry room, she lifted a bottle of detergent, dull blue liquid sloshing inside. If I drink this, she thought, does everything stop hurting? The thought wasn't dramatic. It was a plea. She raised the bottle to her lips. But memory intervened. Not warmth, but command. Her grandmother's voice. You were not born to die. She shook, set the bottle down, collapsed to the floor. That was the moment she understood rock bottom, not as death, but as the wish for it. She left the laundry room with eyes that no longer belonged to a child. She was 14, and something inside her had been buried alongside a baby named Canaan. The world did not know it, but Oprah Winfrey had survived her own funeral. And somewhere beyond that ending, a beginning was preparing itself. But she could not see it yet. All she felt was ruin. Milwaukee had not just taken her innocence or her voice. It had tried to take her future. The fact that she rose from this place would one day make her extraordinary. But for now, she was simply broken. And the next chapter would begin with a man she barely knew pulling her from the wreckage. Not softly, but strictly, forcefully, saving her life the only way he knew how. Salvation did not look like a miracle. It looked like a man waiting at a station, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. Nashville greeted her with a different kind of air, less harsh than Milwaukee, less suffocating than Mississippi. It smelled of possibility and rules. She stepped off the bus, a thin girl with haunted eyes and a small bag that held everything she owned and almost nothing she believed about herself. Vernon Winfrey stood there, not running to embrace her, not reaching for her hand, but standing solid, like a doorframe. You Oprah, he said, as if confirming a delivery. She nodded. He didn't ask how she was. He didn't mention the baby, or the scandal, or the whispers. Instead, he said, we have rules in this house. That was her welcome. No tenderness, no softness, just structure. But structure, to a girl who had known nothing but chaos and secrecy, was its own kind of kindness. A kindness she would only recognize later, His house felt different from every place she had ever lived. The floor was clean. The air was steady. There was food, but not indulgence. Every item in the small home had a place, and now so did she. Oprah did not understand yet that this alone was radical. To go from being an inconvenience to becoming a responsibility someone took seriously. Vernon did not coddle her. He did not ask her what she wanted. He showed her what was required. Chores, curfew, church, homework placed on the table at certain hours, books stacked deliberately, television limited, if at all. He checked her report cards as if they were medical charts, treating bad grades like an emergency. "I'm not going to raise no fool," he told her. His voice was firm, but beneath it was a conviction that startled her. He believed she was capable. No one had ever demanded excellence from her before, because no one had ever seen brilliance in her as a possibility. He did, and he enforced it with a severity that scared her. There was one sentence he repeated, one that would echo in her bones for years. "I would rather see you floating in the Cumberland River than bring shame to this family." It sounded brutal, threatening, terrifying. But to a girl who had already stood at the edge of her own life in a laundry room with detergent in her hand, this threat contained something new. Someone cared whether she sank or swam. His love was not the tender kind. It was not lullabies and hugs. It was curfews and consequences. Yet it was love, even if neither of them had the language to call it that. In Nashville, time began to obey a different rhythm. Mornings were for school, afternoons for reading, evenings for chores and church. She sat in pews, Bible in her lap, soaking in words about redemption, forgiveness, purpose. They sounded like rumors about a world she had never been invited into. Her mind, hungry and unbroken despite everything, latched onto them. If God could make something of suffering, then hers, massive and jagged as it was, might not be completely wasted. Vernon insisted that she read. Books became a lifeline, not to escape reality, but to reframe it. She read scripture, discovering voices who cried out from pits and prisons, women who were overlooked and then chosen. She read poetry and novels, finding in their pages that human pain was not unique to her. It was a language others had spoken, survived, even transformed. Words began to feel like tools, not just to tell stories, but to carve out space where there had been none. In classrooms, the girl who once hid her swelling belly beneath baggy clothes now sat straighter. She raised her hand, answered questions, argued points with a confidence that startled teachers. One of them pulled her aside. "You have a way with words," they said. "You should use that." A simple line, but for Oprah, it was a counterspell against every insult, every whispered judgment, every silence that had told her the opposite. Maybe I'm not nothing. The idea was small, but it flickered. Oprah began entering speaking competitions. She joined the speech team, standing in small auditoriums with trembling hands, reading passages with a gravity beyond her age. She didn't just memorize texts, she lived them. Her voice held something audiences couldn't quite name, a weight, a tremor, a depth that came from surviving more than most of them would ever see. Judges circled numbers on score sheets. Her name was called more and more often. She won small trophies, their metallic shine a fragile early proof that she could be valued for something other than what had been taken from her. Then came the pageant, Miss Fire Prevention. On paper, it was a local civic contest, teen girls in sashes reminding communities about safety. But to Oprah, it was an audition for a different life. She stood on stage in a modest dress, hair neat, posture firm. When she spoke into the microphone, her voice did not sound like a child's anymore. It sounded anchored. She answered questions with ease, sprinkling humor into seriousness, her laughter disarming, her sincerity undeniable. When they placed the crown on her head, it was small, almost flimsy, but symbolically it was enormous. The girl in the potato sack dress who had once been laughed at in a Mississippi church now stood in front of an audience that applauded her, not because they pitied her, but because she had earned their respect. On the way home, sitting in the car with her sash folded in her lap, she looked at her reflection in the window and thought, maybe I am not ruined. Maybe I am beginning. Nashville did not erase her past. The grief of Canaan still lived inside her. The scars of abuse and abandonment still burned at the edges of her thoughts. But the city, under Vernon's rigid guidance, taught her something Milwaukee and Mississippi never had: agency. She could choose what to do with her pain. She could fold inward and let it consume her, or she could pull it apart, name it, use it. One Sunday, after church, the pastor asked her to read scripture aloud. She stepped up to the front, the Bible heavy in her hands. As she read, she felt something new, a current, an energy running between her voice and the people listening. They leaned in. They felt her. Later, someone told Vernon, "That girl has a gift." He didn't melt into pride. He simply nodded and tightened the rules. "Then she better not waste it," he said. At 17, opportunity arrived disguised as mere chance. A local radio station was holding a contest for young speakers. Read the news, deliver it clearly, win a prize. It sounded simple. It was not. Oprah walked into the studio, nervous fingers clutching her notes. The room hummed with equipment: switchboards, microphones, cables. A man pointed her toward a seat, adjusted the mic, and told her to begin. She opened her mouth. The girl who had once whispered to insects in a lonely farmhouse, who had once stayed silent while the world ignored her agony, who had once wanted to drink detergent just to end the ache, now spoke with a calm, measured command. Her voice filled the room. Not too high, not too childish, but grounded, warm. She read the script, and every word carried the residue of all she had endured. This wasn't just practice. It was reclamation. When she finished, the producer looked at her, then at the others. "Let's bring her back," he said. "She's got something." They gave her a part-time job reading news, $100 a week. To many, it was just a student gig. To her, it was the first time she was paid not for her labor, not for her silence, not for her obedience, but for her voice. Nashville had not removed the darkness from her history, but it had given her tools and discipline to rise above it. Under Vernon's ticked eye, she became an honor student. She stayed off the streets. She read, spoke, competed, worked. The girl who had once believed she was damaged goods was slowly being reforged into something else. A young woman who understood suffering deeply enough to one day hold the world's pain without flinching. Rebirth did not come in a single moment. It came in small choices: early mornings, studied lines, obeyed curfews, earned victories. And somewhere between the farm and the radio booth, between Canaan's grave and the microphone light turning red, the girl in the potato sack quietly died. In her place, a queen began to rise, though she did not yet know that one day millions would call her by her first name, as if she were family.